It's the year 2002. Nintendo's GameCube, having already launched the year beforehand, was struggling to make an impact in the console market. It had an image problem that limited its perception towards families and younger children. However, Capcom was about to make a deal with Nintendo that sounded too good to be true. 5 games, one of which would be a potential system seller, could be the one thing to revive Nintendo's fortunes. They recognised that the Nintendo GameCube was one powerful piece of hardware to excel when it came down to creativity, but Nintendo and Capcom got a lot more than they bargained for in the end. We're going to be talking about the Capcom 5 and why it ended up being such a futile move in the years since its conception.
Only on Nintendo GameCube.
The Capcom 5 came about years after Nintendo's grip on third-party developers started to wane significantly in the 5th generation of consoles. One of the biggest mistakes that Nintendo had made in hindsight was the use of cartridges over CDs for the Nintendo 64. Now, Nintendo was correct in saying that cartridges, they were more efficient than CDs in loading data. Games loaded up pretty fast on the N64 back then, and they were much harder to pirate back then. The problem with cartridges back then was that they just held far less data than CDs. A CD could hold up to 700 megabytes, but an N64 cartridge could only hold up to 64 megabytes. What it means is that a lot of things developers wanted to add to their games, like full motion video, detailed voice acting, and bigger areas in video games, they were extremely limited on the N64 unless it was compressed to the absolute bone. Resident Evil 2's Nintendo 64 port is a great example of this. How Capcom was able to just fit all of that data in on one cartridge is beyond unbelievable. Third-party developers just saw the cartridge format as expensive and limiting for the games that they wanted to make. And most famously of all, Squaresoft, they opted to develop Final Fantasy VII for the PS1 instead. The CD format offered far more storage and the royalties being offered were much cheaper compared to Nintendo. We all complain about how expensive video games are at $70, but would you believe me that if you had to pay $80 for a Nintendo 64 game at launch, now if you look at a PS1 game that you could buy on release, it would cost you $50 at the time. When you consider the added costs of making cartridges and the storage size disadvantages compared to using CDs, it made the PS1 a much more appealing console to develop games for. Nintendo was faced with third-party developers opting to make fewer games overall for their console, whilst they were churning out games for the PS1 like clockwork. By the end of that generation, Nintendo had lost its dominant position in gaming within just a few short years. Nintendo had to go back to the drawing board and realise that cartridges were not going to cut it. It wasn't going to make it onto their next console. Instead, they decided that the GameCube, aka Dolphin, would use discs. There was one catch though. When you look at the 6th generation consoles at the time, like the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox, both of those systems used DVDs to store their games on. The increased size of DVDs meant that full motion video could be much smoother, you could have extra content on the disc. Sometimes you didn't even need to use more than one disc, because there was the option to use dual layer discs. A few games used this method of storage like Gran Turismo 4, God of War 1 and 2, and Halo 2 to name a few. Nintendo on the other hand opted to use their own disc medium, a custom disc that would stop to 1.5 gigabytes of data. They were extremely similar to mini DVDs if you ever saw those back then. They made the same mistake as they did with the N64 back then. In choosing a disc format to avoid inflating the prices of their consoles, they ended up making discs that held less storage than their competitors. When you have a game with detailed full motion video, high resolution textures and extra content, you can't have that on a single GameCube disc. A few more type-like games like Splinter Cell Chaos Theory and Enter the Matrix had to use 2 discs to fit on the GameCube, whereas some games just compressed the data or just cut content entirely. Next up, the GameCube was going to be much more powerful than the PS2 and the Dreamcast, but less powerful than the OG Xbox, and it would be much cheaper than the PS2 and Xbox as a middle ground option focusing solely on the games. The GameCube, it cost $199 at launch. But despite all of these efforts, Nintendo's console just didn't do as well as people thought they would do. First of all, look at the design. The GameCube's design is raved upon by everyone today, but back then, it was seen as a kid's toy, not the kind of console someone would be looking for back in 2001. The PlayStation 2 and the Xbox on the other hand, it always gave away that core energy, that emphasis on being the consoles that had the coolest games back then. No offense to Nintendo, but when your core audience is wanting more mature games, the GameCube didn't provide the best first impression back then. The lack of DVD functionality hurt it a lot, and the PS2 used that to its advantage. By the time the GameCube released, the PS2 was already having games like GTA 3, Gran Turismo 3, Metal Gear Solid 2, and a lot more flying off the shelves. The Xbox had Halo, a genre-defining title for consoles at the time. The GameCube, well, it had Luigi's Mansion and Smash Melee. Both of those games are celebrated today, but they weren't really seen as strong launch titles back then. Within 1 year, the GameCube, it wasn't doing very well because of all of those factors. It only sold 4.7 million units, and Nintendo was really seeing its confidence in the console start to slip away. But Capcom had one trick up their sleeve for Nintendo. The Capcom 5 all stemmed from the transition from the 5th generation of consoles to the 6th generation. Resident Evil 4 was originally supposed to release on the PS2, but midway through development, Shinji Mikami, the game's director, he already began to feel frustrated with the console's development toolset. Quick disclaimer, and I'll make this quick. Compared to the PS1, the PS2 was made intentionally harder to develop for on the basis that developers would learn how to get to grips with the system's hardware, and that mindset worked solely because it was the dominant console at the time. Mikami was one of the few developers who wasn't convinced by this approach to spend ample time on trying to learn how to develop for the console. He first held a meeting with Microsoft, who were hoping to secure exclusives for the Xbox from Japan. They'd been struggling to find their feet in the region, and whilst it started off well at first, Mikami's body language began to signal to Microsoft's negotiators that he wasn't happy with the answers he gave. He needed a reason to justify why he should move away from the PS2. Mikami asked Microsoft's team a blunt question about their involvement in the console industry. What is your philosophy? Sony says that games are entertainment, something larger, fueled by the emotion engine. Nintendo says games are toys, created by the legendary Shigeru Miyamoto, perhaps the greatest game developer of all time. What do you feel? Microsoft didn't give an answer to that question, and the meeting didn't work out. Given the shit show that the Xbox is going through right now, I like to think that they've never properly answered this question after 23 years in the business. By the time they tried to strike up a deal, it was already too late. Mikami already went to Nintendo, who successfully negotiated exclusivity for Resident Evil 4. It'd be released on the GameCube as a guaranteed system seller. Now, I feel it's time to talk about each of these games without putting too much detail into them, just giving a general idea of what they are and how they play overall. Killer 7 is a unique game and one of the first games that put Suda51's name on the map. He's also known for creating games such as No More Heroes, The Silver Case, and Lollipop Chainsaw. It's also one of those games that feels really underappreciated in a vacuum. The game's premise involves 7 assassins, each of which form the mind of an elderly man called Harmon Smith. All of them are performing assassinations on behalf of the US government, but they're drawn deeper into a government conspiracy soon after. The gameplay is simple and largely on the rails in terms of exploration, being able to move and select which area you want to go to. The combat takes a much more different approach with a first-person view, where you can scan enemies and use their weaknesses against them. If one of the assassins dies, you will eventually get revived by another one, Garcian Smith. If he dies, the game is over. I personally haven't played much of Killer 7, but if the No More Heroes series is anything to go by, I strongly think that Suda has cooked with this game. Beautiful Joe is one of the first games released as part of the Capcom 5, and a significant one at that. It was produced by Clover Studio, known for some of Capcom's more creatively striking output later on, including Okami and God Hand. It's a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you play as Joe, a young man who is obsessed with tokusatsu films, who's drawn into another world when his girlfriend gets kidnapped. He eventually becomes Beautiful Joe, fulfilling the dream of being the tokusatsu hero he always wanted to be. Beautiful Joe plays really well as a beat-em-up, with the premise of being able to get VFX points. The more enemies you beat, the more puzzles you'll solve, the more VFX points you accumulate to do a couple of special moves. Also notice a big pattern here. The games we've covered so far all have amazing art styles to begin with. This was the era where the cel-shaded visual design really shined, and games like Beautiful Joe use this to great effect. Great game, I do want to play these at some point in the future. This is the most divisive game on this list, and after giving the game a try, it's not hard to see why very few people talk about PN03, or Product Number 03 as they call it. It's an action game set in the far future in a space compound. You play as Vanessa C. Schneider, a mercenary who's dispatched to deal with robots that have become hostile. The gameplay is relatively simple to understand at least. You are able to move and dodge enemy attacks and shoot enemies, but with the exosuit that you're given, you can perform energy beam attacks that are a lot more powerful. At the end of each level, you're given points which are then used to purchase upgrades for Vanessa, including various power suits and abilities. However, you can't move whilst in combat, and the controls, yeah, I just don't think they work in an action game like this. I honestly can see why it just didn't do all that well critically and commercially. Dead Phoenix was supposed to be a shoot 'em up involving a man named Phoenix flying with wings and shooting enemies as he went along. It took a more fantasy-like setting than with any of the other games on this list, but we really don't have much to go on with this game compared to the others here. It was initially planned to release in mid-2003 in Japan, but after a failure to show up at E3 that year, Capcom eventually cancelled the game. It was more of a proof of concept than anything, but the Capcom 5 turned into the Capcom 4. This game needs no introduction, and it was the centerpiece of the Capcom 5. Resident Evil 4 was pinned as the game to boost the GameCube's fortunes. As a franchise that once began on the original PS1, it also was supposed to display a complete reboot of the gameplay. Gone are the tank controls and pre-rendered environments. You are playing in a third-person environment where aiming is much more precise. You have much better control of your movements, and Resident Evil 4 is where you see a focus towards action, a decision that probably didn't benefit the series long term if we're really being honest here. You're playing as Leon S. Kennedy, a US government agent who was sent to a village in Spain to save the president's daughter. Along the way, he also has to deal with the infestation of Las Plagas that has overrun the village and turned them into mindless creatures. This is the best Resident Evil game that I've played, and it was supposed to be one of the GameCube's biggest saving graces. The question is, what went wrong? None of those games ever managed to push GameCube sales at all. PN03 failed both critically and commercially to move the needle, Dead Phoenix got cancelled, and Capcom investors, they were just not satisfied with the GameCube's overall performance. It was deemed as an unprofitable console to develop for, with each new game becoming even more obvious with its poor sales. Eventually, 3 of these games, Beautiful Joe, Killer 7 and Resident Evil 4, they all got ported to the far more successful PS2. There were compromises in bringing those games to the console, like Resident Evil 4 using FMVs for cutscenes, and Killer 7 having significantly longer load times and framerate problems on the weaker console. But all 3 of those games managed to sell better on the PS2 overall. Not only that, but the PS2 version of Resident Evil 4 got additional content as well, aka the Separate Ways expansion. Mikami himself had stated he would commit Harakiri if Resident Evil 4 was ported to the PS2, but the shareholders have won out. All 3 games had something in common as well. They'd opened the doors to a whole new slate of games, and even some influence on the industry as a whole. Resident Evil 4 redefined the survival horror genre with a bigger focus on combat and action. Killer 7 had put Studio 51's name on the map, with some of his releases receiving a lot more attention, including No More Heroes, Lollipop Chainsaw, and Shadows of the Damned, and Beautiful Joe led to Clover Studio creating Okami and God Hand before its development team moved on to create Platinum Games. Even PN03 had some impact. Its gameplay served as the core basis for what would become Vanquish. For Capcom themselves, they had decided to move on from making exclusive games as the main focus of the company. They had lost tons of money on exclusive titles and opted for multi-platform development as their main focus. They also realised that out of the Capcom 5, only Resident Evil 4 was the biggest success and the most established IP. As for Capcom and Nintendo, their relationship had soured because of the PS2 port of Resident Evil 4. They refused to add Mega Man to Super Smash Bros. Brawl, initially because of those ports. Capcom representation only became a thing when Ryu, Mega Man and Ken were added to Smash on the 3DS and Wii U. Nintendo themselves wouldn't gain any significant boost in third-party support until the Switch became a massive success across the board. Now, put it this way, were these games genuinely great and managed to change the industry for the better? Yes. But did they really help Nintendo in trying to change the GameCube's fortunes? No. Whatever you think of the Capcom 5, you cannot deny that it was one of the biggest initiatives done to push platform exclusivity to boost its support. And while we're seeing more developers move away from exclusivity in general, this was one of the first examples where it just wasn't viable enough, but what we got from the resulting fallout of this entire saga was a futile effort to do so. Now, I've made a couple of videos talking about consoles in the past, of course, and they'll be popping up on screen, so make sure to check them out. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, comment and subscribe to the channel. It's really appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.